Stop! That's the wrong translation. A major investor slams his hand on the mahogany table. The boardroom goes deathly silent. $1 billion energy deal is crumbling in real time. 14 elite interpreters have struggled for 3 hours. But the two sides still cannot understand each other. CEO Emily Carter looks around the room in despair. If this meeting ends now, her company loses everything. Suddenly, the door opens. A janitor walks in to clear the cold coffee cups. He hears a few seconds of the heated argument. Then he speaks a single sentence in perfect Russian. Everyone freezes. They don't know that this janitor speaks 8 languages. The morning sun hit the glass towers of Manhattan like a golden blade. But inside the headquarters of Meridian Global, the atmosphere was cold and sharp. Emily Carter, the 30-year-old CEO, paced her office. This was the most important day of her professional life. In the next room, delegates from Russia, Germany, Japan, and the Middle East were waiting. This deal was a $1 billion energy partnership. It was the kind of deal that could change the world or destroy a company if it failed. Emily had done everything right. She had hired 14 of the most expensive interpreters in the country. They were professionals who usually sat in the booths of the United Nations. She thought she was prepared for any linguistic barrier. She was wrong. While the high-stakes drama unfolded on the 43rd floor, Samuel Ortiz was starting his shift in the basement. Samuel was 35, a man whose presence was often felt but rarely noticed. He was the building's night shift lead for the custodial staff. To the executives in their $3,000 suits, Samuel was just a part of the building's machinery. He was the man who emptied the bins, the man who buffed the floors, the man who made sure the coffee was hot and the surfaces were dust-free. But Samuel lived a double life. In his small, modest apartment in Queens, he was simply Dad. He was a single father to 10-year-old Leo. Every morning after a long night of scrubbing floors, Samuel would walk Leo to school, his hand tucked firmly into his son's, promising a better future. The scars on Samuel's life were deep. 2 years ago, he had lost his wife, Maria, to a sudden and aggressive illness. The tragedy had shattered his world. Before the grief, Samuel wasn't a janitor. He was a brilliant linguist and a cultural consultant for international NGOs. He had spent his 20s traveling from the deserts of the Middle East to the frozen plains of Siberia. He didn't just speak languages, he understood the souls behind the words. But when Maria died, the light went out. Samuel couldn't travel anymore. He couldn't be a world-traveling consultant while his son was crying for his mother. He chose invisibility. He chose a job that allowed him to be home for dinner every night. He traded his suits for a gray uniform and his global influence for a mop and a bucket. Samuel was a polyglot of the highest order. He was fluent in 8 languages: English, Russian, German, Arabic, Japanese, Spanish, French, and Portuguese. Yet for 2 years, he hadn't spoken more than a few sentences to anyone at Meridian Global. He kept his head down. He kept his secrets hidden under his blue work cap. On this particular Tuesday, Samuel was asked to cover an extra shift on the executive floor. There was a major meeting, and they needed constant turnover of refreshments and trash removal. Samuel didn't mind. The extra money would go toward Leo's new soccer cleats. As he pushed his heavy cleaning cart toward the grand boardroom, he could hear the muffled sounds of chaos through the thick oak doors. Even through the soundproofing, the tension was palpable. He waited at the door, holding a tray of fresh water and clean glasses. He heard the Russian delegation shouting. He heard the German representatives sounding confused. He heard the Japanese delegates whispering in a tone that indicated deep offense. Samuel sighed. He knew the sounds of a failing negotiation. He had been in those rooms before. He checked his watch. He just wanted to get through the shift. But as he pushed the door open to begin his duties, he heard the lead Russian interpreter make a catastrophic mistake. The interpreter used the word dolg instead of otvetstvenost. He was telling the Russians they were in debt when the contract was actually talking about environmental responsibility. Samuel stopped. Samuel, his hands tightened on the handle of his cart. He looked at Emily Carter's face. She looked like she was watching her own execution. Samuel looked at his bucket. He looked at his mop. For 2 years, he had been a ghost. But as the $1 billion deal began to bleed out on the table, Samuel realized that some ghosts are meant to speak. He set the tray down on a side table. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't wait for a turn. He just looked at the Russian lead and spoke. And in that moment, the janitor disappeared and the master linguist returned. The boardroom was a theater of frustration. Victor, the Russian energy mogul, was standing up, his face flushed with anger. He was a man who valued respect above all else, and right now he felt insulted. "This is unacceptable," Victor shouted in Russian. "You treat us like children. You talk of debts we do not owe." The 14 interpreters were in a state of panic. They were talking over each other, trying to correct the record, but they were only making it worse. The Arabic delegation was looking at their watches, ready to leave. The German representative, Hans, was shaking his head, convinced that the Americans were trying to hide a legal loophole in the fine print. Emily Carter felt the room spinning. "Please, everyone, we can fix this. We just need to understand what the issue is." But no one was listening. The bridge of communication hadn't just cracked. It had collapsed into the river. Samuel Ortiz was standing in the corner, holding a stack of discarded napkins. He watched the scene with a practiced eye. He saw the subtle cues that the others missed. He saw that the Japanese delegates were offended not by the words, but by the posture of the American lawyers. He saw that the Arabic delegates were worried about a religious clause that had been poorly translated. But the most immediate fire was Victor. Samuel knew that if Victor walked out, the others would follow like dominoes. He looked at Emily. He saw her desperation. He remembered his own life, how a single misunderstanding had once cost him his career. He couldn't let it happen to her. He stepped forward. The security guard near the door moved to stop him, thinking he was just a confused worker. But Samuel didn't stop. He walked right to the edge of the mahogany table. "Excuse me," Samuel said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a frequency of authority that cut through the noise. The room went quiet. 14 interpreters stopped mid-sentence. Emily Carter looked at him, her eyes wide with shock. "Samuel, what are you doing?" Samuel didn't look at her yet. He looked directly at Victor. "Господин Victor," Samuel began. His Russian was perfect. Not the academic Russian of a textbook, but the rich, soulful Russian of a native from St. Petersburg. "Proшу прощения за это недоразумение. Oni использовали неправильное слово." Victor froze. He looked at the man in the gray uniform. "Who are you?" he asked in Russian. "I am the man who makes sure your coffee is hot," Samuel replied in Russian. "But I am also the man who knows that you are not talking about money. You are talking about the honor of the land. The contract uses a word for debt. It should use the word for stewardship. If you look at page 12, line 4, you will see the intent is respect, not a bill." The Russian interpreter's jaw dropped. Victor looked at the contract. He looked back at Samuel. A slow smile began to spread across his face. "Stewardship," Victor whispered in Russian. "Yes, that is what I meant." But Samuel wasn't finished. He turned to Hans, the German representative. In a split second, his brain switched gears. He spoke in flawless, formal German. "Herr Hans, die Unsicherheit, die Sie empfinden, rührt zu mot loi dich tuat trong diu Juan Bauhim. Nakonfaila mot ruira chintri, mala mot binfap Antoine Kitwat." Hans sat back, stunned. You speak German as well?" "I lived in Berlin for 5 years, sir," Samuel replied. Then Samuel turned to the Arabic delegation. He spoke in a soft, melodic Arabic, addressing the cultural nuances of their investment. He finished by nodding to the Japanese team, offering a traditional, respectful bow, and a sentence in high-form Japanese that acknowledged their patience. The 14 interpreters looked at each other. Some looked ashamed. Others looked like they had just seen a magician perform a miracle. Emily Carter stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly. "Samuel, how do you know all of this?" Samuel took off his blue work cap, revealing a face that looked much more like an executive than a janitor. "I used to be a cultural consultant for the United Nations, Miss Carter. I speak 8 languages. I just didn't think you needed them until today." The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The anger evaporated. The confusion turned into intense curiosity. "Sit down," Victor said, gesturing to a chair. "I have a trash bin to empty, sir," Samuel said. The trash can wait, Victor insisted, his eyes gleaming. The billionaire deal cannot sit, talk, translate. Emily Carter pulled out a chair, her own chair, and gestured for Samuel to take it. Samuel looked at the mop he had left by the door. Then he looked at the billion-dollar table. He sat down. And for the next 3 hours, the janitor became the conductor of a global symphony. For the next several hours, the boardroom transformed. It was no longer a place of conflict. It was a workshop of understanding. Samuel didn't just translate words. He translated intentions. He explained to Emily that when the Balinese delegates were silent, it wasn't a sign of disagreement, but a sign of contemplation that required a respectful pause in response. He showed the American lawyers how their aggressive negotiation style was being perceived as a lack of trust by the Middle Eastern partners. He moved between the 8 languages with a fluid grace that left everyone breathless. He was like a master weaver, taking threads of different colors and making a single beautiful tapestry. The 14 interpreters stayed in the room, but they were now Samuel's assistants. They watched him with a mixture of awe and humility. He taught them in real time. Don't just translate the noun, he would whisper. Translate the history of the noun. Emily Carter watched Samuel from the side of the room. She realized she wasn't just watching a man speak languages. She was watching a man who possessed a deep, profound empathy for all of humanity. He understood their fears, their prides, and their hopes. At one point, a complex legal disagreement arose regarding the Japanese environmental standards. The Japanese lead, Mr. Tanaka, was becoming visibly distressed. Samuel leaned in. He spoke to Mr. Tanaka in a voice that was barely a whisper. He used an old Japanese proverb about the strength of the bamboo that bends but does not break. He explained the American legal requirement in a way that aligned with Japanese values of harmony and longevity. Mr. Tanaka's eyes softened. He nodded slowly. I understand now, he said in Japanese. Thank you, Samuel-san. As the clock ticked toward 5 p.m., the tension that had gripped the building for weeks began to melt away. The delegates began to laugh. They began to share stories. They were no longer the Russians or the Germans. They were partners. Samuel was the catalyst for it all. By the time the final page was ready for signing, the room was filled with a sense of triumph. One by one, the most powerful men and women in the energy industry put their pens to paper. A billion-dollar deal was born. When the last signature was dry, Victor stood up. He walked over to Samuel and shook his hand vigorously. You, Victor said in English, you are the most important man in this building. Why are you cleaning floors? Samuel looked down at his hands that were used to chemicals and rough work. Life has a way of changing your plans, sir. I did what I had to do for my son. Victor looked at Emily. If you do not give this man a job that matches his brain, I will take him back to Moscow with me. Emily smiled, but her eyes were serious. Don't worry, Victor. He's not going anywhere. The delegates left the room, each of them stopping to thank Samuel personally. The 14 interpreters followed, some of them asking for Samuel's business card, only to realize he didn't have one. Finally, it was just Emily and Samuel in the quiet, messy boardroom. The sun was setting and casting long shadows across the mahogany table. Samuel, Emily said softly, I don't know where to start. You saved us, not just the company, but the future of this project. Samuel stood up and reached for his mop. I'm glad, Ms. Carter. It's a good project. It'll help a lot of people. Stop, Emily said, stepping in his way. You can't go back to the basement. You know that, right? Samuel looked at her. I have a life, Emily. It's a quiet life. It's a safe life. I don't want the stress of this world again. I did it for 10 years. It took me away from my wife. I won't let it take me away from my son. Emily nodded. I respect that. But what if I told you that you could do this on your own terms? What if you were our head of global relations? You set the hours. You don't travel unless you want to. You spend every morning and every evening with Leo. But during the day, you help us talk to the world. Samuel hesitated. He thought of the basement. He thought of the smell of bleach in the silence of the night shift. Then he thought of the way it felt to finally speak again, to use the gift he had been born with. My son needs new soccer cleats, Samuel said with a small smile. Emily laughed. I think we can manage that, and a lot more. Samuel looked at the boardroom one last time. He realized that for 2 years he had been hiding. He thought that by being invisible, he was protecting himself from pain. But standing in that room, he realized that his gift wasn't a burden. It was a bridge. I'll do it, Samuel said, but I get to keep my blue cap. Deal, Emily said. The transition from janitor to executive was not as simple as changing clothes. For Samuel, it was a journey of rediscovering his own worth. The first thing he did was tell Leo. Leo, Samuel said that night as they sat on their small balcony, do you remember how I told you that every person in a building is important? Leo nodded, his eyes bright. Yeah, because if the janitor doesn't clean, the CEO can't think. Samuel smiled. Well, today the janitor helped the CEO talk, and now I'm going to have a new job. I'll be helping people from all over the world understand each other. Leo hugged his father tight. I knew you were a superhero, Dad. I just didn't know your superpower was talking. The next Monday, Samuel walked into the Meridian Global lobby. He wasn't wearing his gray uniform. He was wearing a navy blue suit that Emily had sent to his apartment. He looked sharp. He looked capable. He looked like the man he was always meant to be. The security guard, Mike, who had seen Samuel every night for 2 years, didn't recognize him at first. Can I help you, sir? Mike asked. Samuel smiled and took off his new sunglasses. It's me, Mike. I'm just coming in a little earlier today. Mike's eyes went wide. Samuel, is that you? Holy cow, you look like $1,000,000. I feel like a man who finally has something to say, Samuel replied. Samuel's new office was on the 42nd floor, just one floor below the boardroom. It was filled with books in dozens of languages. It was a place of peace. But more importantly, it was a place of power. In the weeks that followed, Samuel became the most sought-after person in the company. Whenever a difficult email arrived from a foreign partner or a video call was going poorly, the call went out. Get Samuel. But Samuel never forgot where he came from. He didn't spend his lunch hours with the other executives in the fancy dining room. Instead, he would go down to the basement. He would sit with his cleaning crew, sharing coffee and stories. He listened to their problems. He heard their voices. One day, Emily found him in the break room, talking to a young woman who had just started on the maintenance team. Samuel, Emily said as they walked back to the elevators, you're the only executive I know who hangs out with the janitors. Samuel stopped and looked at her. Emily, the reason those 14 interpreters failed is because they only looked at the words on the paper. They didn't look at the people. If you want to understand the world, you have to talk to the people who build it, not just the people who own it. Emily was silent for a moment. She realized that Samuel wasn't just teaching her languages. He was teaching her leadership. The billion-dollar deal was moving forward smoothly, but a new challenge arose. A group of local farmers in the region where the energy plant was being built were protesting. They didn't trust the big corporation. They didn't speak the language of lawyers and engineers. The PR team was failing. They wanted to send in security. No, Samuel said in a board meeting, send me and let me go alone. The board was hesitant, but Emily backed him. Let Samuel handle it. Samuel went to the site. He didn't bring a suit. He didn't bring a laptop. He brought a thermos of tea and a willingness to listen. He spent 3 days speaking the local dialect, sitting in the dirt with the farmers, hearing their fears about the land and their ancestors. When he returned, he didn't have a legal document. He had a promise. He had negotiated a way for the plant to be built while protecting the sacred sites of the locals. He had found the heart of the conflict and healed it with words. The board was stunned. They had saved millions in legal fees and potential delays. But Samuel just shrugged. They just wanted to know that we saw them, he said. Invisibility is a heavy thing to carry. A year passed. The Meridian Global Energy Project became a global model for ethical development. It was profitable, yes, but it was also peaceful. Samuel Ortiz was no longer just a consultant. He was a partner. But if you asked Samuel what his greatest achievement was, he wouldn't point to the billion-dollar contract on his wall. He would point to the small building across the street from the headquarters. It was the Meridian Language and Cultural Center, a school Samuel had convinced Emily to fund. It was free for all the employees of the building, from the security guards to the cleaning staff. Samuel wanted to make sure that no one in that building ever felt invisible again. He wanted them to have the tools to speak, to grow, and to be heard. One rainy Tuesday morning, Samuel was walking through the lobby. He was on his way to pick up Leo from a school field trip. He saw a young man, barely 20 years old, pushing a cleaning cart. The young man looked tired. He was staring at the floor, moving like a ghost through the crowd of busy executives. Samuel stopped. He didn't just keep walking. He walked over to the young man. "Excuse me," Samuel said in a kind voice. The young man looked up, startled. "Yes, sir? Did I miss a spot?" Samuel smiled. It was the same smile he had given Victor. "No, you're doing a great job. I just wanted to ask, what's your name?" The young man hesitated. It's David, sir." "Well, David," Samuel said, handing him a small card for the language center. "My name is Samuel. I used to have your job, and I can tell you from experience, the world is a lot bigger than this floor. If you ever want to learn how to talk to it, come see me on the 42nd floor." David looked at the card. Then he looked at Samuel. For the first time all day, he stood up a little straighter. "Thank you, sir. I'd like that." Samuel nodded and continued toward the revolving doors. As he stepped out into the New York rain, he felt a sense of peace. He wasn't the janitor who spoke 8 languages anymore. He was a man who had found his voice and was now helping the world find theirs. The most important voice in the room isn't always the one that speaks the loudest. It's the one that listens the best. Never look down on someone just because they are holding a mop. They might be the only ones who know how to clean up the mess we've made. If this story touched you, share it with someone who feels invisible today. And subscribe for more Iron Dad stories.